To discuss this issue with us further, we're joined by political expert Dan Polton. Now, after hours of grilling talks, a breakthrough came, but what will make this pledge more lasting than the previous one, Dan?
Well, I mean, it's obviously an incredibly tense situation, but I think, and we don't know, it's obviously too soon to say. I mean, some of the factors behind this involve the fact that what began a coup in Kiev, which was hopefully going to be seen as kind of clean-cut pulling of Ukraine into the sort of Western sort of EU orbit, has actually turned into this grueling and very brutal sort of quite big war actually inside Europe. 5,000 people, over 5,000 people dead, and so on. There's been failed talks before, but clearly, for all the attempts to isolate Putin diplomatically and politically, it's not been possible for the Kiev forces to regain the ground that they lost in the east of the country. So they're looking for a political solution, and the fact that it comes at a time of big instability in Europe, and we're talking about the IMF loans that are going to be put in place, but also you can't ignore the situation with Greece. There's a lot on the EU's plate at the moment, so they're hoping to come up with some kind of compromise solution that will stick. Kiev is obviously quite unhappy with the agreement, but this could be a case of Europe saying, look, you've got to accept what you've got, you've got to accept the situation as it is, and try and move on. Whether they will, that's the big million-dollar question, really.
Now, we know that what has been agreed is a ceasefire, heavy weaponry withdrawal and prisoners being released, but there are still ongoing negotiations regarding rebel autonomy in eastern regions and the status of Debaltseve, and issues around international borders being returned to the Ukraine within the year. So how successful do you think this process towards peace is likely to be?
Well, I think we've seen a kind of attempt to ramp up tensions by most of the Western leaders. If you look at, say, Britain, which is, I know it's a few steps removed from the process, but you look at some of the rhetoric that's come out around Russia recently, calling Putin a nuclear terrorist and this sort of stuff. Quite a lot of hot rhetoric coming out, and so on. Clearly, this has to be seen as part of the attempt to expand the influence of NATO and the EU within Europe at a time of instability. So these are kind of factors that could see the undoing of this kind of deal, really.
Now, you say that Kiev is looking for a political solution, but we know that the US military will be training Kiev troops fighting against militias in March. What will this mean in terms of the ceasefire?
It'll make it very difficult. The reality is that from the beginning of the coup in Kiev, the Americans have had their fingers all over this. There's been lots of talk about Putin's involvement in the region. Whatever. It's been very hard to get exactly to the bottom of what that amounts to. But it's obviously clear there has been some Russian involvement. But it's equally clear there's been a high degree of US involvement. The very coup itself was actually partially engineered and inspired by the US State Department. They have a lot of investment in this. They're putting $2 billion in. As you say, they're doing the kind of training of troops. They want to expand, as part of the project, expanding NATO eastwards right up to the Russian border. This is a very provocative move to make, and it'll make any kind of deal much harder, really. So I think, on the one hand, the EU has a kind of desire to have some kind of stability. The idea of another war in Europe is very dangerous for them. But on the other hand, America clearly want to continue this expansionary project.
Now, you mentioned also the ramping up of tension by the West. Now, as you've said before, EU is more towards stability, as Russia is, and they've both agreed that there can be no military solution to the Ukrainian crisis. But why has the US taken this stance?
Well, as I say, I mean, since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there has been a concerted, decades-long attempt to expand NATO eastwards, and they've been pushing and pushing and pushing, expanding their bases, trying to get on board with this sort of expansion project, despite pledging not to. And at a certain point in this process, Russia's pushed back, and we've seen the very concerning results of this. But this is part of an ongoing project, particularly as America's economy is rivaled by other growing economies. They are focusing more and more on the military side of things, which is a very dangerous situation that could escalate.
Dan Polton, political expert, thank you very much for joining us today.